"Slow down, kiddo," Brad called, but there was no real urgency in his voice. They hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary the whole time they'd been out. There had been no sign of human disturbance during their hunting, and he didn't hear anything strange now. He was only calling Sammy back because he knew Anna would want him to. She didn't like for her son to be out of arm's reach. It wasn't that Brad didn't understand why, but he also knew that Sammy had to learn things on his own. He didn't lecture Anna, but he tended to let the kid test boundaries when they were out without her. There had been several times today that he'd hung back, letting Sammy lose sight of him. The boy hadn't panicked. He'd stopped and listened each time, and then followed the trail Brad had been sure to leave. Just a few twigs broken or leaves rustled, but that had been enough. He'd been proud of the kid. He hadn't been worried of losing sight of him. Sammy was wearing the bright red t-shirt he always wore when they went out hunting together. Since it was the spoil of a looting trip Brad had made a few weeks ago, it didn't fit exactly right. However, it made him easy to spot, and Sammy didn't seem to mind that it was a little long for him. It probably wouldn't be too big for too much longer anyway. The growth spurts that had made Brad's mother sigh in frustration had started happening when he was around Sammy's age. "I'm just excited to show Mom," Sammy said, running back to Brad with an ear-to-ear grin on his face. He was practically bouncing up and down as Brad knelt to tighten his bootlace. "Come on, it's fine. Can't you walk faster?" "What's the rush?" Brad asked. Sammy waved a limp brown form in Brad's face, nearly brushing his nose with the animal's fur. He had the recently deceased creature in an unnecessarily tight grip. It wasn't going anywhere. "Yeah, it's a rabbit," Brad said, keeping his tone deadpan. "She's seen one before." Sammy shook his head emphatically as Brad rose to his feet again and took a moment to stretch. "No, this isn't the same." "What's different about it? 4 feet? 2 ears?" "This one's different because it's one that I caught," Sammy said with an air of great importance. "Oh, so you think your rabbit is better than mine?" Brad asked, faking a look of wounded pride. "Duh," Sammy said with a grin, before running ahead once more. This time Brad let him go. They were pretty close to the cabin by now. Of course, if Anna saw her son before she saw Brad, he'd never hear the end of it. He pushed his hands into the pockets of his jeans and picked up his pace only enough to keep the boy in sight. They'd been out in the woods since sunrise, and it was getting late. He considered himself an energetic guy, but he was an 8-year-old kid energetic. 9-year-old kid, he corrected himself silently. He had been keeping careful track of the days in a notebook since he'd been moved to the safe house. Once he'd gotten to the cabin, he'd drawn up a calendar so that he didn't forget anything, and Anna had informed him a few days before that Sammy would turn 9 today. Sammy himself hadn't said anything about the day being significant. Actually, he might not even know what today was, or what made it special. He didn't seem to have the same need to mark time that Brad and Anna did. But his mother had wanted to make the day as special as she could. Brad wasn't sure what she was planning to do, but he'd held up his end of the bargain by keeping Sammy out almost all day. It was the first time he'd taken the boy so far from the cabin in the 5 weeks that he and Anna had been back. Probably because Anna was damn near pathological about keeping Sammy where she could see him. Brad was glad that she'd let him free today, though. He enjoyed the kid's company, and hunting alone got boring. The hunting trip they'd gone on today had gone very smoothly, even if they didn't bring back quite as much game as Brad could have gotten alone. It had gone much better than any of Brad and Lee's hunting trips ever had, to be perfectly honest. Lee had tended to be impatient with both Brad's hesitation to shoot and his strong dislike of bugs. Once, Brad had scared away a massive buck when he'd discovered an eastern harvestman crawling up his arm. He'd yelled so loudly that he'd probably scared away every bit of game in a 5-mile radius. "Jesus Christ, it's harmless, you idiot!" Lee had hissed as Brad scrambled backward, smacking at his clothes and checking obsessively to make sure that he'd gotten the creature off of him. Lee had been popping up more and more in his thoughts lately, and Brad knew exactly why. For the past 5 weeks, he'd been expecting his father to walk through the cabin door. So far, it hadn't happened, and the question had begun to wear on him. There was so much evidence that his father had been there.